Here we go. That we record these talks, and so the last one actually is up on YouTube. And so if you want to send it to anybody, or if you missed it and you weren't here last time but you're here this time and want to see it, I can easily get you that link, and you should be able to watch it. But yes, second session of our apologetic summer series. The first one was on the reliability of the resurrection. This one is on the moral argument for God. We'll have two more this summer, July 31st and August 7th, I believe are the dates. If someone can fact check that and prove me wrong before the end of the talk, that would be awesome, because I don't want to lie to you. But the July 31st will be on evangelism. So the next two talks are a little bit different. They're not as, let's say, like apologetic, like information and logic heavy, but I think they're very important topics. And so evangelism will be the next one. Why do we share the gospel? How do we share the gospel? What does that even mean? And then the last talk of the summer will be on discipleship, just the idea of biblical discipleship and all the avenues that might take. But yeah, I think that's enough kind of background, and I'll pray us in, and then we'll dive right into the talk if you're okay with that. Dear Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for each person here. Thank you for just each person that you have brought here. We know that you brought us here for a reason, and I pray that you would make this night memorable, that it would be encouraging, that it would be edifying, and most of all, that it would be used. That you would use this information, use whatever you would tonight to stir our hearts, that we might go from here and use this information, that we might tell those around us, ask them questions, be encouraged in our own faiths, and not just be stagnant as a church body, but active in our community and our families and our friends, and that we would just radiate not only your truth, but your love, your character, through everything we do. So bless these people tonight as we're here. Bless my words. I pray that I would speak only truth. And if there's anything, as always, Lord, that is not true or not factual or not what you have revealed to us, please let that just be forgotten. Let it be taken from the minds of people here and myself. I pray that that which is true, that which is right, as you have decreed it, would stay, and that you would just let us all walk away from here excited for the truth that you have revealed to us. So bless this time, and in your name we pray, amen. All right. So I wanted to open tonight just kind of giving a review that some other people have done in the past for me, and I found it quite helpful. The first question, and this is very obvious because I gave you an extremely strong hint, is what makes rope so strong? Why can rope hold hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands of pounds sometimes? This is a question that someone has to answer.
Multi-strands.
Exactly.
Multi-strands, the stronger the rope.
Right. Multi-strand, stronger the rope, as a movie once incredibly wisely said, each together strong. Right? So the more strands you have, the stronger it is. And that is what we call the cumulative case for God. So there's lots of arguments for God. And the key is not any one is this magical gotcha. Right? There's no like silver bullet. It's not just the throw this out, win every argument, checkmate atheist. That's not how it works. But there are really strong arguments, and there's lots of them. And so if we just had one, it might be dangerous, relying on just that one for your whole faith, right? But we have so many things to rely on. We have lots of different arguments. More importantly, we just have the words of the Bible. But some of these include the cosmological argument. That is just everything came into existence, kind of how, right? If something exists, if there's creation, there must be a creator. There's more to that, but that's a big one. The ontological argument, which, has anybody ever heard of the ontological argument? Just curious. I know a couple of you have. Yeah, it's kind of one of those ones where it's like, I've heard that name, but I couldn't tell you what it is. I've heard multiple talks on it, and I still couldn't probably tell you the whole thing. It's intellectually dense. It's a lot, but it's great. It's kind of a philosophical one, using purely logic and reasoning. The idea of, if I can imagine the greatest possible being to which no greater being can be imagined, does he have to exist or not? And you might think that is the silliest thing I've ever heard. And yet it has stumped philosophers for literally almost thousands of years. Really, I guess suppose the last 1,000 years, more or less. So that's a good one. There's the fine-tuning of the universe, irreducible complexity, intelligent design, life. The moral argument, which we'll be doing tonight. There's the argument from consciousness. There's the argument from beauty, miracles, and testimonies about miracles throughout history. The argument from just experience, from what people have experienced. There's more. But I did want to start with that. This is just one piece of an incredibly strong rope. And it's one of the reasons I love learning this stuff in apologetics it's such a joy to be able to study all these and confirm, like, yes, right? There are reasons for what I believe, that the evidence is in its favor. I'm not just taking a shot in the dark, and that's super encouraging. And just another thing, actually, before I move on, these that I listed are just cases for God, not Christianity. So the cases for Christianity itself are incredibly strong, right? You have fulfilled prophecies throughout the Old Testament. You have the reliability of Scripture. We talked last week, the reliability of the resurrection, eyewitness accounts, etc. So the case for Christianity is incredibly strong, and that's on top of all of these. So I think that's just a good way to start to put everything in perspective. But we are diving into the moral argument. So why the moral argument, right? If it's only part of the way, it doesn't get us to Christianity. It gets us to God. And so that's something to know. That's very important. Well, why, right? It's for theism, right? The belief in a God. And there's certain attributes that we'll kind of hit on that a theistic God has that can't fit every religion's definition of God. So that's important. But it's not specifically for Jesus. Why? Because we're building a foundation, right? So we're laying the bricks. If someone doesn't believe in God or anything spiritual, right? This is a great foundation to build, to ask questions, to make prodding statements, right? Not to immediately say, well, Jesus is God. First you have to show them, like, is there a God? Why should I think so, right? And so it goes part of the way. We'll touch on that a little more later with an illustration that I find helpful. Has anyone ever heard of or seen this movie? I would be delighted if anyone in this room has ever seen this movie. No way.
I have heard of it, I have not seen it.
I just found this on Google, and I thought it was an incredibly funny cover for a movie. It looks super corny. Why did I include it? Because that, I'd say, is my experience with this topic. I'd say morality as a whole, right, the idea of the moral argument for God, is currently under fire. Hence the extremely corny topic. Welcome, everybody. If you can't find seats, you're welcome to pull up some others. There's some in the front, but it's called the spiritual splash zone, so just be warned. But yes, this is arguably the most prevalent topic in our current education system, our culture, just as a whole, not even just education culture. But this is under fire. You will hear this a lot. Not presented as the moral argument for God, but just talks about morality. And I'm sure all of you already know that, right? You can think of places where you're seeing this already under fire. It's a very attacked point, where the people around us, kind of society, I know culture is a very vague term, but really the culture we live in currently, at least in America, and the education system in colleges, this is very contested. Whether it's kind of on the subsurface, it's just kind of small attacks, or it's right up front, saying you're wrong if you believe this. And so I think that's important. And high school students, this talk is directed at everybody, but especially at you. Because where I've experienced this the most is in college. So when you go to university, I can promise you, no matter where you go, right, you will encounter pushback on this. Some places it's very, very, very strong. Some places it's not as strong. But this is a large tension today. But I'm kind of putting the negative side, right? I'm saying a lot of, it's going to be, pressed, you're going to be attacked. I don't want to inspire fear, because on the positive side, this is also the biggest conversation starter about God in my experience. So one of the reasons I really wanted to do this topic is it is the #1 way I've found doors opened to share the gospel, to share my faith, to talk about God, to ask prodding questions. And that's huge, right? And we'll get into more, what is the role of all apologetics? But spoiler alert, it's to get to the gospel. And this is an amazing way to do that. So this is important. I really would stress this. This is super important. And it's as important as you make it, right? So there's people in each of our lives that we know, I'm sure, that don't not only know Christ or believe in Him, but just believe in God in general, right? Or at least have a firm place where they stand. It's kind of the gray, I don't know, right? A lot of people kind of slap on the label of agnostic, which just means I don't know what to think about it. Some people are genuine, but, right? It is important to think about, who do you know that you can apply this to? You'll get out tonight as much as you want to get out. If you just absorb it and leave, you might be like, that was cool. You might be like, that guy was kind of annoying. But if you really try and get something from this, I promise it will be helpful. There are so many ways to apply this, and it is so easy to weave into conversations in so many places. So yeah, I would encourage, think about that person, right? Maybe write their name down on the note sheet. I don't know, it might seem silly, but it really is important. If you have someone practical to apply this to, it makes a difference. Okay, definitions. Every apologist's favorite thing to do. Luckily for you, I'm not that smart, so I kept the definitions very simple. So the first two, you probably already know, but it is important to hash them out, is objective versus subjective. Okay? So objective. It is something that is independent of people's opinions, right? A truth that is universal, is factually set. If I claim 2 + 2 = 4, nothing can change that. Yes?
And yet some people still think 2 + 2 is fish.
It might be, who knows? But yes, right? So you can think whatever you want, right? Someone could say, I really think 2 + 2 is 5. That doesn't change the fact of the matter. So objective is independent of your opinion. It's independent of your time, right? When it is. It's independent of what you think of it. If someone says 13 is a prime number, we can test that, right? We can see if that's true or not, but it's not going to change. So objective, dependent on the object. Subjective, dependent on the subject. It is changeable. It's dependent on opinions. It's changeable. It's transient, right? So if someone claims that squash is the tastiest vegetable, they are objectively wrong.
Thank you.
Exactly. No, jokes aside, if someone claims that, that is their subjective opinion, even if it's a terrible one. But it's subjective. It's dependent on the subject, right? They're claiming this, and it could be, true for them. It could be, yes, I do think this. Someone else could have a different one. That's subjective, okay? Dependent on subject, dependent on object. You guys already know that. It's just good to hash it. Now, values versus duties. Values are personal principles. They're like notions of good and evil. Duties are the rules pertaining to those, right? Your moral obligations. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And those usually go together, but they're not the exact same. So there is a difference between values and duties. And last one, it's small, but it's important, is just is versus ought. Just so you think I'm not throwing out random sounds, phonetic sounds. When I say is or ought, right, is versus ought, this is an is not ought. I'm saying that science, right, or observations can tell you what is. Mathematics can tell you what is. In fact, they're really good at it. That's their whole job, is honing in the precision over history and decades on what is. But they cannot touch what ought to be. And yet all of us as humans have some notion of how things ought to be, in some sense. And so this is important of just is versus ought. And we'll get into the oughtness of morality in a bit. So now that you have the pretty simple definitions under your belt, we finally get to the actual question of the evening. This is the big question. Can you be good without the existence of God? I want you to think about the question just for a second. Just mull it over. What does that question mean? What does it imply? What is your answer, perhaps? Sure.
Okay, so I think the question of so can you be good without the existence of God is basically saying, can you be good without having someone to follow and pledge your allegiance to at all? And without having, it's basically saying, can I be a good person without having a code blue, without having a code, how to be a good person?
Yeah, okay, I think you kind of nailed it. So I think I'll touch on what you said in just a moment. But people have very strong answers to this. And so here's a couple examples. Are you good without God? Millions are. The good life without God? It's possible. Lincoln atheists. And why believe in a God? Be good for goodness sake. That's a phrase that I have heard before, and it's clever, right? But these are some of the answers, and people will feel very strongly about this. And at first glance, a lot of people take this as a very arrogant question. They say, of course atheists can be good people, right? How dare you imply that they can't, right? They can live good lives. They can do good moral actions. In fact, many people who don't believe in God have lived better moral lives than supposed Christians throughout history, which on some level is sadly true. But that's not the question. The question is not, can atheists be good people? The question is, can you be good if there's no God? Is there such a thing as goodness? Is there such a thing as morality, good and evil, without a God? That's the question. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I realize that since God is good, if we were created without God being there, we wouldn't be good because God created us all, every single human that's ever been created, has been created, and will ever be created in His image.
Yeah, so we'll have to get to like, where does good come from? And so I assume most of us are probably like, we get good from God. But many people are like, no, right? And so we see lots of different opinions. This is on campus. This is at Mines, part of that club that I told you about, Christi. And now I'm wearing their merch. So, but lots of different answers, right? And yeses and nos, some very strongly yes. You saw that one last week. But they're not all the same yeses and nos, right? Each person has a different rationale behind why they're saying yes, why they're saying no, how they're interpreting the question. And so there's a lot of different opinions out there. So how do we figure out what's true out of all the opinions, right? How do we cut through all the noise? Well, that's where the moral argument for God comes in. That's the purpose of this argument, and here it is laid out in the classical format. It's just 3 premises, and it's quite simple. It's this: if God does not exist, objective moral duties and values do not exist either. 2, objective moral duties and values do exist. Therefore, lastly, God exists. And you might think it can't be that simple, or you might be thinking, duh. Like, of course, right? But we're going to dig into these premises a little bit more and try and hash out each one. And I should have mentioned this at the beginning. I totally forgot. We'll do the first section sort of like last time. It might be a little bit shorter, but there's kind of a decent part to stop in the middle. So we'll cover the information, the argument. I'll kind of give the background for it, some evidence for it. And then we'll take a short break, depending on time. It could be 2 minutes, it could be 5, it could be 10. And then we'll do the second half, which is going to be common responses, right, or arguments against this, common objections that you're going to hear, and tips, practical tips on how do we talk about this, what questions do we ask, what do we need to know. If you need to go in the middle time, you certainly can. I would encourage sticking around for the second part, because I think that's the more important part. That's why I put it second, so that you kind of stay. But we'll dive into it. Okay, premise 1. If God does not exist, objective moral duties do not exist. So what are our objective moral duties? Right, when I say this, we already talked about the definition of objective. Well, they're moral laws and obligations that apply to all peoples, regardless of time, regardless of location, regardless of your culture, right, or what you were taught, and regardless of your perception of those morals, or your opinions on what they should or shouldn't be, or what they do or don't really mean. Okay? So this is the definition of objective morals. And objective morals are needed for true good and evil. And I think we'll touch on that in a bit. But I would propose this, right? If you need 2 + 2 to equal 4 and it can't equal 5, and we need, right, to apply these all to something, we need a universal standard to judge them off of. If you want objective morals, you need a standard that applies to everyone. You might be thinking why, you might think that makes sense. An analogy I like is these silly little cartoon people floating in space. But to them, which way is up?
Anyway.
Exactly, right? And that's what it is always. It's easier to picture in space, but there's no like up direction, right? Up for us and up for Australians is opposite. Right? So there's no like set up. It's all referential. You need a reference frame. If you're big into physics, that's all of physics, right? It's all referential. Like it's all relative. You need a reference frame to determine anything. Right? That's Einstein's whole theory of relativity. And so we need a reference frame if you're going to evaluate anything. That's what it is for all things. And another example is a speed limit. How do you know if someone's driving quicker or slower than what they should be? You need a speed limit, right? You need to evaluate them according to this. You're driving 35. The speed limit is 30, right? It seems obvious, but we need a standard to apply to. Now, that standard also has to be external. And we'll touch on that. If it's not, then it's subjective. Then it's me. So it can't be objective. And it can't be something arbitrary. Okay? So it can't be something that we just pick because why not? If it's going to apply to everyone, there has to be a reason that it's applying to everyone. There must be a reason to appeal to it as a standard. It's got to have weight, meaning behind it. And I would argue that a universal law, a universal standard, requires a universal lawgiver. But whose moral standard do we accept? Right? There's a lot of different moral standards that we see today. A lot of people recognize you need a standard. In fact, most everyone recognizes you need a standard for morality if you think about it. But whose do we accept? Well, I would propose that there's a couple attributes that are required if this moral whatever, right, this moral law, this moral standard is to apply to all people. One, total sovereignty, right? Total supremacy and authority over all people, all things. This way humans are beholden to it, right? They are under this system. Otherwise, why should I have to follow it? Two, it has to be immutable. It has to be unchanging, is basically what that word means. So that the morality isn't changing. So that the morality of that system doesn't fluctuate from one time to the next. And it's not objective, right? Yes, I think that explains it well enough. The one implementing the system can't change, or at least the system itself can't change. Three, I'd say you need total power. You need absolute power in order to enforce this. And some people might not like that point. In fact, I've had people who don't like that point before, but I think it is important because otherwise there's no weight behind it, right? Morals have no weight if there is no consequence, right? No power to institute why this should or shouldn't be followed. It's just a suggestion without it, right? It's a hey, just try and do this. But that doesn't have the weight that we need for a true, like, universal objective standard to claim this is good, this is evil. And those don't mix or change. And then lastly, I'd say it has to be immaterial. He has to be immaterial. Whatever it is has to be immaterial. Because morals are immaterial things. You can't suddenly conjure up these immaterial ideals of morals from matter. Yes?
And you can't just, and morals have existed as long as human societies have existed, because you can't carve the moral, you can't make moral laws.
Right, they can't just come out of nowhere, and they seem to have, they would have to be here at least as long as we have. And so I think you have to give account for when did these come into existence and how. Electrons don't magically make morals. So I think the immaterial portion is also important. So reviewing these, right, what you need to institute this moral law: sovereignty, it has to be immutable, it has to be unchanging, someone with power to enforce it, someone who's immaterial. I think you have in mind, I know someone who fits most of these attributes. Right? But the idea is God fits these, right? The conclusion is how we would define a theistic God. And of course I put a picture of Jesus because it was very funny to do that. But the idea is we can't immediately get to Christ, but we have these attributes of a theistic God. Right? The standard has to be set by this God that is above all things, or at least what we typically define as God. I think you can go a bit deeper into some things, and I didn't think it was probably worth our time, but you can spend some time getting out why I think it needs to be a person, not just a force. There has to be a mind behind it, a mind behind a lawgiver. There are some pretty intense debates on like a high level that I was like, trying to like get out what both sides are saying. But I think you can show that. But this is the track I like to think of it. This is the track that makes sense to me. If it doesn't make sense to you, that's fine, you can just scrap it. But I like to think of this whole premise as if you want objective good and evil, true, right, and wrong, that applies to all people, you need a law or standard external to people. Well, if you want an external standard, you need an external lawgiver, external to people, and we define that as God. Right? Basically all cultures define that as God, even if they have different ideas of how he works or what he looks like or who he says he is. So that's the path. If you want objective good and evil, you need something external, a law or standard. If you want that, you need God to give it. We'll talk about more with objections and flesh this out a little bit more, but I want to get to premise two. Premise two is that there is objective morality. So now that we've at least somewhat shown, you need God for objective morality. And if you don't have God, you don't have objective morality. The second premise is, well, there is objective morality. This is William Lane Craig. He's a famous apologist. Many of you probably know him. This is his quote. He said, "I initially thought that this, the second premise, would be the most controversial premise of the whole argument. In my debates with atheists and philosophers, however, I find that almost nobody denies it. Surveys taken at universities reveal that professors are more apt to believe in objective moral values than students, that philosophy professors are more apt to believe in objective morals than professors in general. Who's surprised by that quote? Because I was. I was very surprised, especially the philosophy professor's part. But he's shown that as he goes around, most people don't deny this, even on a high level, right? A debating philosophical level. Why do you think that is? I'm curious, as a church, why do we think that most people don't deny this? What are the reasons behind it? What's the rationale?
It's just, there's really no way to dispute it in a lot of ways. Like, we can just look around and basic observation of the world.
It's
And-
difficult to disprove.
That's fair.
And ultimately, if you don't have objective morals, then it all leads downhill to, what's a good example? How, I wasn't gonna go there, but yeah. How could you?
What was the example?
I mean, if we don't have objective morality, ultimately it all leads downhill to, how can you say Hitler was wrong?
Absolutely. Right? And so most people recognize that. If you don't have this set thing, how can I condemn other people? We'll get to that. But I like what the first answer was. As Christians, we know the law is written on our hearts. Right? So here's your answer. Why do most people not deny this? Romans says it. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law, right, like physically to read, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. Right? And so I really do think it's pretty evident as we look around, and I think the stats, which I didn't really put any up, show that most people don't want to say there's no good and evil. There's really no morality. We all know it. We all feel it. We all live like it. Greg Koukl, he wrote the book Tactics, or Street Smarts. I like him. He's a good apologist. He said this quote, that deep down, people are certain some things are bad in themselves. Count on that. And that was his advice in the book Street Smarts, where he's kind of talking about how do we talk to people about this. And I would absolutely agree with him. Count on the fact that people know there's morality. They do, even if they say there's not. Even if they're arguing for that, their hearts, their conscience, they know it. Now we can suppress, right, the knowledge of God, we can suppress the knowledge of truth, but deep down, they know it's there. We know how things ought to be. Everyone does. Everyone has some sense of how things ought to be, even if those thoughts of how it ought to be are conflicting. But many still fight for moral subjectivity, whether intellectually or unintentionally. A lot of people just don't like the idea of a certain, standard. This is the truth. This is the law. And so they fight against that, fighting for something that, admittedly, I think a lot of people don't really know what the consequences, right, or ramifications are of. But, so we should talk about it. Moral subjectivity. Well, what is the problem with it? Why is this such a bad deal? We've already talked about it a little bit, but I want to hear one or two thoughts of what's the big problem with moral subjectivity. Why can't we just have our own versions of what's right and wrong?
Because of the fact that this is the first time I've been asked this question, but I feel like that we cannot have our own versions of right and wrong. If someone's actually, if we do, please, I'm trying to have no time thinking about
No worries.
this. Okay. Can you come back?
Yeah, take some time to think about it. That's a good skill. Yes, sir.
It leaves you in a battle of authority,
Right.
right? So who says?
Absolutely.
So, and it's also very subjective. Some people are subjective, especially around in our culture. You see that with sexual morality is very subjective to a lot of folks. But take their car, take their money out of their bank, and then all of a sudden they're absolutely moral. That's wrong. It's unjust.
Right, we'll touch on that for sure.
Something that I was going to reference for the other question as well is that people kind of use what was the previous question before this? Because that was crucial to answering the other one.
The why do they know it?
Yeah. Why do you think it is? Is because it's like a way to judge themselves and what their actions are doing right versus wrong, which is why they believe in some sort of moral standard. And then for moral subjectivity, like the problem with that is anyone can say, oh, I'm doing right and you're doing wrong, but they're doing the same thing that I'm doing. It's almost like hypocrisy.
Right, so you
It doesn't
have,
make sense.
like both of you are saying the same thing, of you have all these conflicting standards. So who's right? So the first problem with that is you can't condemn anyone. If morality is dependent on the subject, then the only person I can apply it to is me. If I get to decide morality, it only applies to me. So I cannot condemn anything outside of myself because they don't have my standard of morality, right? It's arbitrary. And so all the time, right? All the time we see people love to talk about evil, to complain about wrongs, right? And that's why I think this is such a good conversation starter, because all the time, if you hang out with anybody, someone's gonna be complaining about something, right? That something's wrong, something bad was done to them, to someone else, etc. But if we don't have this objective thing to apply it to, how can you condemn anything? And I would argue, in fact, that's very selfish of you, because you're saying my morality is better than yours, right? I know you think that's right, but I know better than you, right? And so you're wrong for doing this. That's very selfish, right? If you're the one who came up with that morality, it's just, I know better. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, on the inverse of that, you can't praise anything. And so a lot of people, they try to not be worried about the condemn. It's like, just accept everything. And yet, I don't think they'd like the implication that you can't praise or magnify anything. You can't improve your morality. You can only change it, right? And so how can I praise something outside of myself in the same way as I can't condemn it? Many people today in our culture and people I've encountered will, very vehemently tell you that it's wrong. Let's see the best way to word this. It's wrong for you to claim that others are always wrong for doing something. Do you see the irony in that statement?
Yes.
Self-reflection.
Right, exactly. So you're saying I'm always wrong for saying that these people are always wrong for doing this thing. It doesn't make sense. And that's the circle that we find ourselves in, right? We will be in an endless loop of, like I said, who says, right? Like, how is this wrong? I don't think so, right? I don't think so. And what's good and evil can completely change. What I think is good, and I want to be like, yeah, I'm going to pursue this, can change by the next day, let alone 100 years.
What about the people who say that, like, the objective moral standard is what culture says, or like the average of most people?
Right, and we'll get, that's one of the main ones that we'll talk about in a second. So I'm going to put a pause on that question. But morality can change, and then lastly is just there's no meaning to it anymore. So the main problem with subjective morality is there is no weight behind it. It's totally arbitrary, and that's going to be the biggest theme as we talk about why can't morality come from culture or majority or evolution or what's good for human development. It's all arbitrary unless you have something external that you are really have a good reason to apply it to. And the sad part is today we see right in the effort to give meaning, to highlight and lift up all moralities, all viewpoints, you have destroyed any meaning behind any of them. Right? As you attempt to bring up, how about this one though? And this one's good too if you look at it from a different perspective, right? And that's the postmodern world. And we see it with truth, but truth encapsulates morality as well. And so as you try and give meaning to them all, you have ripped them, made them utterly devoid of meaning to all of them. They have no weight. They can't, right? Unless some of them are truly right or wrong. And we already talked about what you need for something to be truly right or wrong. Oops. Spoilers. Last part is it's just not livable. It's just not. No one truly lives out the real logical conclusion of moral subjectivity. There's a story I heard that I like a lot about this one. It's from Frank Turek. Some of you might know his name. He's another famous Christian apologist. He gives a story of someone he knew. Who knows honestly if it happened or not, but he heard this story. Now I'm telling you a story that he heard. But a student turned in a paper at a college university and he wrote lots of pages on moral subjectivity, on the fact that we can't ground morality in anything. There is no God. There's no external standard. So it's all devoid of meaning. There's no true right or wrong. You can just make up what you want, but it's a construct. It just kind of satiates us, right? It makes us feel better so we can get through life. But there's no true thing, no such thing as fairness, justice, right? We just kind of need those to feel better. And I will say this, that is internally consistent. But can you live it out? So the professor, he turned it in a blue folder, The professor gave it back to him in the blue folder and gave him a big F. And he said, F, I don't like blue folders. And the student was very upset. And so he went back to the professor and said, that's not fair, right? Like, this is absurd. And the whole point was, right, they talked out, he basically said, you don't believe that because I did something that wasn't fair or didn't meet your moral standards and you were outraged after just claiming it's not a real thing, right? And that it's something that just the common public needs to feel okay. Yes?
Yeah, why, and yeah, I noticed that I now, after some time of thinking, I noticed another problem with moral subjectivity is because if you think some really horrible things are happening, you could just, if you have a different version of morals than what is the very obviously clearly defined morals in the Ten Commandments, something that all Christians would follow and live by, you could just go kill anyone you wanted to and not feel bad about doing it because there's no such thing as morals and you don't have any consequences for your actions.
Yeah, so accountability and consequences are gone. Of who are you to say I'm wrong? Why do we get to lock up serial killers? They just have a different standard, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. And with that story about the student with the blue folder, right, where he gets an F and he gets outraged, what that tells you, it's a good principle just for all life. You can tell what someone really believes based on how they react. Not just how they act, a lot of times how they act, right? But people can, right, change how they act, but how they react is how you really know what someone believes. And no one truly lives out moral subjectivity, right? Reactions always tell us people believe in defined morals. Now, they might think they're the ones who get to decide that, but they think there are clearly defined morals. So there's a problem there. It's not livable, which is not, you can't have that for a worldview. If a worldview is not livable, it's not tenable. It's also just nonsensical, right? So again, back to the idea that you can't have good if you don't have God. You're claiming to be a lawful citizen in a lawless land. So if you say there is no overarching, objective law that applies to us all, then back to the speed limit analogy, you can never say someone's speeding or that someone's a law-abiding citizen, right? It's like saying I'm really following the law officer when I'm driving in the middle of the desert and nowhere, where there's no speed limit, right? That makes no sense. You have to have the limit, you have to have that law over you so that you are applied to it, so that you are under it, right? The reference frame, like we talked about. Kai Nelson is an atheist, or he might claim to be agnostic, but I'm pretty sure he's a naturalist professor, but he talks about just in the atheistic worldview, the worldview without God in the picture. He says, reason does not decide here. The picture I painted is not a pleasant one.'s talking about just truth and reason and morality from the atheistic worldview. He says, reflection on it depresses me. Pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. And he's right. You cannot get morality from subjectivity, right? From something that's just arbitrary. You can't give an account for morality. And that's the key. We talked about most people know morality exists. So the question is not, can you know morality exists? Basically, all of us do. It's how do you account for it? And if your worldview cannot account for morality, then it's flawed, right? It's not consistent with reality. It's not consistent with the facts. So, what do we say as Christians? Right? What's our answer to the question? Going all the way back to the question, we say no. Right? No, you cannot be good without the existence of God. I like how Isaiah 33:22 says it. It says, for the Lord is our judge, he is our lawgiver, he is our king, he will save us. We have a lawgiver. We have someone we look to. We have a way to give account for our morality. And really the core of this, right, is that belief in God is not necessary for objective morality. God is. And that's what we want to press people on, is it's not if you believe or not, it's if he is or not. And which result does that lead you to? And then again, kind of back to the equation that I like, which is if you want good and evil, everyone thinks there's good and evil. Well, if you really want that, you need objective morality. And if you have objective morality, you need an external standard that applies to all of us. And if you have an external standard, that can only come from God. That is the only source that will work. We'll talk about a lot of other places, because most people think, right, we are under some standard. Very few people actually claim moral subjectivity. And like we said, they can't live it out. But God is the only standard that will actually work. But this is one of the objections, and I wanted to save it for the second half, but after more thought, I thought it was practical and applied, or applicable and applied. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma. You might have heard of it. You might have heard the name thrown out. It's been around for quite a long time. It was proposed I think around Roman times. But the idea is this. It's kind of a gotcha for Christians and theists. It says, is something good only because God wills it? Then good is arbitrary. It's just whatever he decrees, because why not? Or does God will something because it's good? That's a problem, because then goodness is something independent of God. Something above even him or external to him. Okay, so there's our dilemma. Is it arbitrary, just whatever God commands? Or is it that God does what's good, meaning goodness is something external to him? What's our answer? What do you think? How do we get past this conundrum?
We're not worried if it's arbitrary, we're worried if it's external.
Okay. So, at least at a first glance, the second one seems worse. If goodness is external to God, that's clearly a problem.
Right.
So, are we okay though if it's just God can just decide what's good because? Is there like no rhyme or reason behind it?
I'm absolutely okay with that because he is an omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, good, holy God. So whatever he decides is good is good.
Okay, so you're trusting in his character.
Yeah.
For one, I think it's slightly unrelated whether something is good because God wills it. Like what it says, is something good only because God wills it, then good is arbitrary. I think for one, it wouldn't make a difference if it's arbitrary or not because it's from an external source from humanity.
Okay.
Which, even if it's theoretically arbitrary in the existence that we can perceive,
I see what
it's
you're
still
saying.
universal.
So it's not necessarily arbitrary from our perspective.
Yeah.
But then we kind of are in this gray area of like, why did God do this? Maybe we just don't know the answers. Do we have to leave unsatisfied? I would say this. I think there is an answer, and we've kind of hit on it. It's more on the first one, but I'd argue this is a false dilemma. It's neither of those. They're kind of missing the point. What it is that God decrees good because he is good. He doesn't just decide good. Good, the definition of goodness, and this is why I wanted to include this in the first part, because the definition of what goodness is something that corresponds to his character. He is goodness. He doesn't arbitrarily decide, nor is it external to him. His character is what goodness is. And so when we evaluate what's good and bad, it's not just does it meet this arbitrary law that he set down, right? It's not like he just decided, if you take more than 13,000 steps a day, evil, right? Not arbitrary. It corresponds to his character. And the more something corresponds to his character, the better it is. The more it goes against his character, the worse it is. And his character is unchanging. That's big. And that's important for us as Christians to remember, because our way of assigning goodness, what we really think it is, comes not from arbitrary decrees or laws, and that's how a lot of people think of Christianity. I've met so many people who say, how do you know your standard's right? Right? Like, I just can't follow just because this rule book says to. But that's the thing, is it's not just because it says so and it's arbitrary. Right? There are reasons that these things are good because they correspond to the greatest thing in the universe, namely God himself. Okay, last little section, and then we'll take the 5-minute break. But what is the ultimate example of morality? Or perhaps, little hint, who is the ultimate example of morality?
Here it comes again.
The whole reason why this religion that we are a part of was founded, Jesus Christ himself.
Nailed it. You absolutely called that. Right? All things that humanity sees as morally good are exemplified ultimately at the pinnacle in the cross, in the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is big. And I hope you remember this as you think about the moral argument from here on. What are these? Love, right? So there are certain things that humans have always thought, these are good. These are good things. Everyone knows it. One is love. John 3:16, for God so loved the world, right? Christ's mission here was driven by love. It was encapsulated in the ultimate love for us. 2, humility. Christ, the gospel of Jesus has a level of humility that we will never understand. We will never like truly get. We can know it was the ultimate act of humility, but oh man, until we are actually in heaven and face to face, I doubt we can even scratch the surface of what it means for God himself to come in flesh. Right, Philippians 2:5. Though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, right, but emptied himself, taking the form of servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself even to the point of death, or to the point of death, even death on a cross. That is the ultimate humility, the ultimate act of being humble, is stepping from heaven to suffering, right, and earthly flesh and frailty. And not only that, but dying for those who hate you. So humility to the maximum level. 3, honor, right, living an honorable life. In Matthew 26 is when they're trying Jesus, going to put him to death. And what does it say the Pharisees had to do? They had to have false witnesses, right, come up and say fake things, and it wasn't working. Right? They had person after person come up and say lies about him, and that didn't work because his life was so beyond reproach. They couldn't even pin him down on things he didn't do. And so he had the ultimate, level of honor. They had to pin him down on the fact that he claimed to be God, because he was. Patience beyond what any of us will probably ever imagine, right? Living his years of ministry being followed constantly. Crowds. I imagine, obviously I'm not a parent, I don't know what that's like having children, but I imagine even more so having like 3,000 children that are constantly following you and being like, hey, can you give us like infinite bread again? Please? Right? And most of them following you for the wrong reasons? Right? How many of them were not there for the kingdom of God, but just for the benefits? Right? Having patience despite the ulterior motives, despite being betrayed, all these things. And then lastly, just the ultimate sacrifice. Greater love, right, none than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends. That is the ultimate standard of love, of goodness. And Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice, right, to die for those while we were yet sinners that hated him, that put him on the cross. So this is big. I think when we look at morality, when we talk to people, we want to remember not only does morality show God, right? I think we can use morality to prove if you want good and evil, there needs to be God. We as Christians can say, and look, I have the ultimate standard to look up to. I don't just believe in a God that has goodness. I have the ultimate one, right? No other religion can match the value and the worthiness and the glory of what Christ did. And so what an amazing thing, I think, as Christians. Okay, we're going to take like a 3 or 4 minute break. And if you have questions, I saw some hands up during it. You can come up to me in the middle and we'll chat for a second. For sake of time, I'm only giving you like 3 minutes, so you gotta run. 7:23, if you're stepping out, we're gonna reconvene for the second part. I'm sorry, I've been talking fast because I want to make sure I fit it in. So if you need me to talk slower, please say. Okay. Break. I feel like I'm burning through. So I'm trying to watch the time.
What's up, guys?
Luke, what's the link to that YouTube for your first session?
Oh, yes. I'll pull up the exact date. If you look up, good. R-A-D-I-O, it should come up. You'll see the picture. It should have reliability. So, but those should be the keywords. Just that one. So far, who knows? People enjoy these. We're keep doing them. Although I'm still trying to gauge time.
Cool stuff.
It feels like an absolute
That's great. I know it's this good.
Okay.
Every Monday.
But I am about to in the second part. Funny way, so I'm gonna dig into what is it.
Do you have any arguments against him?
What is apologetics?
I was trying to think.
No, not
So hopefully we'll get that in a second part. So you can think of it.
I'm trying to like.
I saw your hand up.
Because like I would say like
Oh yeah, I was just saying that in part where it's talking about Jesus being an example of morality, it's because he is God, God Yeah, that's such whatever.
Well, also, so like the whole argument is just trying to take existence as God. Just trying to just make God right everything. For the last thing we said, because God is good. Which is kind of interesting because I know you're proving God. How do you prove God? Bring it up after. I probably have some. Yeah. Because. It's like you could prove God.
I don't say how you
Right, but if it's just to prove God. Especially from a Christian perspective.
I'm glad. It's a compliment.
Maybe that's just like.
I really am excited to be doing these. I enjoy it.
I'm not going to go over yonder.
I'm sorry.
I left it at that.
We're going to be graduating. I'm sorry. Yes, sir. I love it. Yeah, I just found out someone he brought it up. He brought it up. It's like a 20 told me it's like this one was like be real. Okay, I'm getting out. Be real. Or you can pay it. Okay. Sorry for the short break. This is for your benefit, I promise. Okay. I know that felt very fast. It wasn't much of a break. It's just the illusion of a break so that you're supposed to feel rested. But now we're going to dig into the second half. This is what I think is the very important part, which is now you know the base information, and we'll get more into it as we go through these. But how do we use it? Right? What are some common misunderstandings that you're going to be presented with? Also, if you're of the younger generation, you're probably looking at that image like, that looks a little off. And you're right, because it was created by an AI. And I was just having fun making random things that I might be able to use for this. And I thought it was so funny. The AI is incapable of generating anything but incredibly chiseled and handsome men. Every time this was the ugliest I could find. This was the worst. It was just a free one. Okay, so AI can only generate image.
Yeah, and when I looked them up, I was just like, two guys talking over coffee, and it would be like these billionaire-looking Hollywood stars. I was like, so I felt obligated to include that. Okay, how do we respond? Getting back on topic. Okay, so right now we're getting into the essence of what apologetics is. So the kind of star verse for all apologetics is 1 Peter 3:15, and I'm going to add through 16 here because I think it's important. Put in your hearts, honor Christ Jesus as Lord is holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is within you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. So that verse is really where we get apologetics from. That word there, defense, apologeia, I think is how it's pronounced. If someone knows Greek, please correct me. But ultimately, it is logic, reason, defense, right? And so from this, we kind of extrapolate this idea of we give the reasons for the hope, right? We give the answers, and show people why it makes sense to believe this. But the second part is so key. We do it with gentleness and respect so that no one can revile your behavior as you talk to them. Okay, so when do you win an apologetic conversation? When you walk away and the other person can't point out ways that you, flawed in your character in the conversation. right? And sin through anger or looking past the person. So, that's a good thing to add actually, is always look past the question to the questioner. That's important, right? When we're doing this, don't get so caught up in trying to win an argument that you forget about the soul in front of you. And different people are prone to different things. I am prone to wanting to win the argument. I get caught up in like, oh, I know the answer to this, right? Or they're wrong in this area and I'm gonna show it, and I can forget about the person. You can't do that, right? You cannot forget about the questioner behind the question. That's the focus. We're looking to reach them through both our words and our conduct. They have to go together, right? So having conduct without reason is not useless, right? You don't have to have all this intellectual premise. But having the reason for the hope, right? Being able to cite it either scripturally or using apologetics and logic and all this stuff, that's really important. That's super good to add on top. The opposite is much worse. Having the words but not the conduct, that's worthless. That's what Paul says, right? If you don't have love, right? If you don't have the conduct that we're supposed to have, you're a clanging gong, right? A symbol. You might as well just be noise, wasting that person's time. And even worse, maybe harming the gospel, right? So we need to make sure we have the character. So knowing the attitude we should have, what's the strategy? Well, the number one rule of all apologetics is to ask questions. I did it in the most dramatic and drawn out animation so that you wouldn't forget it. Yes, with a lot of exclamation points so that you wouldn't forget it. This is the key. As we go through all the practical, the key of all apologetics, all discussions, is to ask questions. If Jesus did it more than anyone, you should probably take a hint, right? So ask questions. It's by far the thing I'm worst at. So I always need to be reminded of it. Here's a quote that is very good. Questions prod the heart, statements harden it. If you know Randy Patton, he's the one who said that. But it's a great quote, right? There's the proverb about drawing out, right, someone's soul. And that's what we want to do. We want to draw out, right, their heart. We want to prod it, make them think. We don't want to harden it by just lecturing. This is it. This is it. I know you're wrong. So, and there always are times, right, you have to explain the hope, right? But asking questions is so crucial. This argument, especially the moral argument, you can demonstrate basically the entire argument or show the error in the other views against it all entirely through questions. You hardly have to make a statement. It's almost purely through questions, and that's so beneficial. And most people haven't considered how to account for the fact that they, know morality exists. And so when you ask questions, you're just getting them to actually have to consider it, right? In last week's, or 2 weeks ago presentation, I listed why do we ask questions, and I listed a couple things of it forces people to consider their stance. It gives the other side the burden of proof, right? It's not just Christians that have to explain why they believe what they believe. Everyone does, right? Who has the best explanation in a sense. It gets you from missing the actual problem. You're not talking over or under somebody. You understand what they're thinking. But that last part is crucial. Most people go through daily life not having considered why they know right and wrong exist. Most people know it's there. Right? Everybody knows there's right and wrong, but not many people actually sit down on a Tuesday afternoon after work and ponder, how do I know objective morality is universal and applies to all peoples and all tribes, right? Like all these things. So we want to draw it out. We want to get them to think about it. A good example or a good analogy for apologetics is putting pebbles in people's shoes. That's what we like to say at Ratio Christi. You probably have heard that before. I love it. It's a great analogy because when you have a pebble in your shoe, you cannot ignore it. It's the worst, right? It's just there. It just keeps annoying you. And that's what we want to do. If we can't get all the way to the gospel, we want to provide truth, right? And put pebbles in people's shoes. The goal, especially the moral argument, you want to drop out, I like to think of it, the worldview, like drop out the floor underneath somebody from their worldview. Show them that they don't have a foundation to stand on and provide, right, a firmer foundation. And if you can't fully get through the second one, it's still good, right, to prod them, get them to think about it, put the pebble in their shoe. It's like planting seeds, right? God does the rest. Another analogy I like to use a lot, and if you don't think this analogy is helpful, you can just scrap it or tell me, but I like this one, is I like to think of apologetics as funneling to the gospel. If someone is not a Christian, the end goal is not to win the argument, not, right, to just show that this has to be true. The goal is to get to the gospel. It is only the gospel, right, and the Spirit and God that changes hearts and changes minds. No one reasons their way into faith. It's always a heart issue. And it can manifest in different ways. Some people know it's purely a heart issue. Some people try and suppress it and say it's an intellectual issue. But we are trying to funnel down to the gospel. And some arguments, right, they have different purposes. Some are very all-encompassing and broad at the top of the funnel. It's a wide net. It affects everyone, where your interests are, and it makes you think. I think that's where morality is. Some of them are very specific, like 2 weeks ago, the resurrection. That's probably down here, right? It's right on it. It's saying, here's the evidence that Jesus was who he said he was. Boom, right? And here's who he said he was. But I like to think of it just as using questions, evidence, arguments to funnel people down to the gospel. And I'd say the moral argument is like there. It's very subjective. But I'd say it's somewhere in there. It doesn't go all the way. But I think we can use the rest of our reasoning and conversations to get it all the way. Okay, now to the actual objections. You're going to hear these a lot if you talk about this. The first main one: what if morality is just societal? What's a thought? For each of these, I want to hear a thought or two. For sake of time, I can't get like a ton of answers. What's a thought from someone I haven't heard?
Like the Aztecs would kill people as part of their religion.
Right. So what about societies you don't like? What about societies you disagree with? It's fine and dandy when you've been raised in this society and you think that all your morals are great, right? But what happens when you look at a very dramatically evil society? Throughout history, societies have had slavery. We still have societies that are aborting female children because they're not as desirable as male children. What do you say about them, right? And how do you decide who's right between those societies? Right? How do they navigate conflicts? When they have totally opposing morals, which society is right? How do you determine that? Right? We said earlier it's an authority issue, and it absolutely is. And then what actually binds you to this societal construct? Right? If it is just the society determines it, once enough people get together and they implement their structure and governmental system, why are you bound to that? There's no immaterial substance behind the US government, right? Like, yes, you can have these systems set up, but why am I actually bound to this system? What authority should it have over me? It's arbitrary. It's a construct. Do you want good and evil to come from something that's just a construct, changeable, right, fluctuating? So we do have a conflict problem, I think, with societies. And so we saw that primarily with the Nazis, right? And I'm sure a lot of people's minds go there. But the Nuremberg trials, right, that's where they tried the Nazi officials after World War II. Allied forces put them on trial, right, the ones that were captured. And it was to kind of, right, just, punish them for their war crimes. And the Nazis made an appeal. It's very interesting. They made an appeal of, how can you condemn us? You're just the bigger bully. You won the war, so you get to say we're wrong. We won the war. We would get to say you're wrong. So how are you any different from us? You just won. You're the bigger bully, and so you're just saying we're right because we said so. We had the bigger firepower. We had more people on our side. You're going to be remembered in history as evil. And I think they had a great point. I think they were spot on if there's no objective standard. How can the society condemn another one? And the response from the US was incredible. And I don't know exactly what it looked like. I've never seen like a quote. But as far as I'm aware, the US officials and just the Allied forces, they said, you're right. But we appeal to something higher. We're not condemning you based on our judicial system. We are condemning you because there is a standard above us, namely God. I don't know if they made an appeal to Christianity and the Christian God, but I know that there was an appeal to God. And they said, because we can't condemn you just from we won, there's a reason that you are objectively wrong. What you did was objectively evil. And I think that's key, is to press people on, is it just whatever society's strongest? How do you navigate conflicts? How can you condemn the atrocities committed by dozens, hundreds of societies throughout history? So we have problems there. 2, what if it's just majority? This is very similar to society, right? What if just it's most people? Everyone kind of knows, we all unanimously agree, come on. Why can't we just say we all know this is wrong?
To go back to Germany in the 30s, the majority of non-Jews in Germany thought what they were going with was fine.
Right, so majority where? Everyone in the world? Is there like a pocket? Who's part of the majority, right? Who gets a say on like what morality is? And then I think more importantly, what about things that majority used to think? So was slavery morally right until it suddenly wasn't? Throughout most of human history, majority of people had slaves and found some way to justify it. Right? So was it right? How can you condemn them? You just say, we're different now. You can't say they were wrong. Right? Same thing with, again, aborting female children, right? Just female rights in general for most of history. Right? Like, how can you condemn these things? It's still a construct. It's still arbitrary. It's changeable with opinions through time. Right? There's not this set good and evil. And so you can't condemn things in the past, nor can you confidently say, we've got it right now. In 200 years, they're going to look back and say, oh man, right? Like they were wrong. So how can you, right? How can you make judgments on anything else? I think you run into a lot of problems there. But next one, this is one that I think you see a lot of people just kind of think, right? Just whatever contributes to human flourishing, right? Whatever contributes to good. Some people, if they think of it in a more scientific sense, right, it's like the flourishing of humankind. If they think of it in a more just kind of emotional sense, it's just like whatever's good, right? Whatever promotes human growth, and obviously that's circular, right? But a lot of people think of it just like that, right? Whatever's growing people, harmony, camaraderie. We know that. So anything that supports that going forward, right? The bond between two sisters, the camaraderie there, whatever supports that, keeps that going. What's the problems with this?
We can't seem to. There seems to be. It's the humans who decide what flourishing is, and I remember back to the part about slavery and talking about that. I remember this quote from the movie set in the era of the American Civil War, which is the war fought about the ending of slavery. You cannot own a child of God.
I think you nailed it right at the start for sure. Who decides? Go for it.
I was just gonna say it's still subjective.
Totally. Right.
It's different opinions on what flourishing means.
Exactly. It's still right. The key trend you'll always see, and it might seem redundant, but that's because it is the connecting thread between all these. It's still arbitrary. So first off, like, what makes that good? Why is flourishing good? Who says? Right, we said that earlier. The kind of theme response is just who says? Why is it good? And you touched on this. Who determines what flourishing is? A lot of different people have a lot of different definitions of what it means to flourish. Right? What progress is. Hitler had his own ideas. He was very strongly committed to them. Right? It always comes back. You can use these extreme examples, but many horrible things in history have been done because someone had their idea of what flourishing really meant. And a lot of them are at least somewhat consistent and logical without God. Right? Like Hitler, really, you can press people on why was his idea horrible? Because you have to, why are people valuable? Right? He said, I'm going to get rid of what he deemed the weaker races, right? Get rid of diseases, right? Like genetic weaknesses, things like that, right? To create, in a sense, the optimal potential for humans. How can someone say that's wrong? Unless you have something to appeal to for why. But he had his idea of flourishing. You have a different one. How do you get to determine who's right? Also, another part of this one, because people bring this one up a lot, just human flourishing, right? Developing, like keeping our tribe together. Why humans?
Squirrels flourishing.
Exactly. But why humans? Right? Like, why just us? What makes us so special? Again, who says that humans are supposed to flourish? We flourish at the cost of many other things. Why shouldn't those things flourish at the cost of us? Why does it have to be something living? Why can't we just try and, like, the best universe is where there's the most iron?
Or where there's the most light.
Right, so like, it's, again, it comes back to it over and over and over, and it's redundant, but it is, these are arbitrary. You want to keep pushing someone on why. What makes human flourishing good? Right? It's still a construct. It's still arbitrary. Okay, this is one that's big. What if morals are derived from evolutionary processes? Now, before we jump into this one, I want to give a big warning. A very large warning. Okay? And so this one is, when we approach this topic, as it comes up, be smart about it. Let's be wise, right? Going back to the gentleness and respect and the conduct and all that. I want to start with bad responses that I've heard. So what's the wrong response? If someone says, right, well, morals are just, they've been evolutionarily constructed, right, over time, over millions of years. Wrong answer, I don't believe in evolution. Or like checkmate, right? Like, you think evolution's real? Evolution isn't real, right? I don't abide to that. Those are wrong answers. Why? Because you're not addressing, you're not sticking to the question, right? So when we look at this, you have to think about what will be productive and helpful in the conversation. My personal advice, what's most times not helpful, is immediately taking the tempting rabbit trail of trying to show why naturalistic theory for evolution is wrong, and it can't be right, and all these things, and I'm going to show you. That doesn't usually work out great, because now you're on this big rabbit trail, and I would add this. Granted, I am not oblivious to the fact that I am at Colorado School of Mines, and so the community I talk to is very different from your average community, but typically, when you go down the trail of showing now why naturalistic evolution can't make sense, and it doesn't all fit together without God, and it can't explain all these things, you have to know your stuff. And if you don't, it's going to be a lot trickier. And the person's probably just going to be like, oh, this was just one of the people who just deny, right? Like, you don't know it. Then you get into a kind of a battle of who says, right? My scientist says this. Well, my scientist says this. And you can get in this kind of just tricky gray area. And my encouragement, the reason I put the warning up, is when this comes up, stick to the question, right? This does not solve the main question. I think there's great ways to combat the naturalistic theory of evolution. I think there's good ways, even with morality, to show why it can't explain all of the moral feelings, the moral obligations that we think we have, right? We can talk about things like self-denial, ideas like denying with self-control things that would be logically good, logically beneficial for what natural selection would at least siphon out and produce. But even aside from that, I think more importantly, you stick to the question and you talk about what they're trying to argue for, right? You have to catch it in the words. So what naturalistic, I keep saying the naturalistic theory for evolution, right? But what that seeks to explain is moral sentiments, a psychology of moral traits, moral feelings. So these are all terms used by Michael Shermer. He's the founder of the Skeptic magazine, which, as you could probably imagine, is not
Can
Christian.
I just make an announcement?
I insist.
Is anybody automotively inclined that might have jumper cables? Anybody?
I don't have jumper cables, but I do have a jump starter in my car, I believe.
It looks like Brady, you got some? Either one of you guys, we got a gal right in the middle of the parking lot, stranded.
Spiritual warfare.
Thank you, sorry to interrupt. Right?
Holy Spirit. So Michael Shermer, he's the founder of that Skeptic magazine, which, as you could probably imagine, is not a Christian source, right? So very atheistic, very anti-God, and he writes this big long article on why evolution can explain morality as we perceive it, and he argues it's obvious that it has developed these moral sentiments, a psychology of moral traits, moral feelings. What's the problem with these? Subjective, for sure. Go ahead.
The whole evolutionary theory hinges on natural selection, which is essentially what Hitler's entire regime was founded on, was natural selection.
That's certainly fair.
The survival of what he deemed to be fittest. It's pretty contradictory to the majority of what we accept as moral.
Right, and so basically, that's not morality. Those are chemical imbalances. Those are feelings. So what evolution can explain is the chemicals in my brain are tipping in a certain way, making me feel a certain way. Right? The meat machine in my head is spitting out a feeling. That is not morality. Right? So again, we're back to subjectivity. There is no objectivity. There's no real morality. It's just you feel a certain way. It's no different than hunger. Right? It's no different than anything. A need for sleep. It's just a feeling. And so the problem, again, without God, however you want to explain how we got these things, is you end up saying there is no set, true morality. It's just feelings, it's just an illusion. But there's no real reason it's right to survive as a species. There's no real reason Hitler was wrong. He just did. We just do. No good or bad about it. We just do. It has always done since the beginning of the universe. And so I think that's where we want to bring this to, is you keep it on subject. When people bring these things up, you always just pin it down to that's still, you're not giving a real morality system. You're explaining that it's an illusion, right? It's a, just construct of, we feel this way, nothing special about it. I also think we run into an agent causation problem. Does anyone know what that means? It basically is saying, the problem with that whole statement is anytime you use we, or I, or me, right? So at the beginning, Michael Ruse, he talks about we are genetically determined to believe that we ought to help each other. We, like I, like how can you hold someone accountable? Again, if all there is just input, output, action, reaction, right? It's just these systems. Who, right, like who is you? In a sense, right? There's just been a cascading chain of events. You can't blame anyone for something. You've probably heard, right, the illusion of free will. It's this idea of you can't give any basis for your own will, your own actions, unless there's something immaterial. Otherwise, you're really just a deterministic meat machine, and it's just been a cascading domino effect since the beginning of the universe. So how can we condemn when the domino falls over here? Say, no, that's horrible, you shouldn't have done that. If, right, this theory of just naturalism, if there is no God, is true, it's just been dominoes since the beginning. So are you going to be mad about the whole domino process? Right, you're just part of the domino process. So I think there's an agent causation problem of just, you can't blame, no one's to be held accountable. Right? There's no you causing something, it's just been happening. And just the whole problem with all of this is, again, we're back to the is versus ought. Right, so looking at natural selection and science and all these things, all they can explain is, but we cannot step into the realm of how it ought to be. There's no basis for that. And that's the problem. And so I think of it like the atheistic spiral of logic. If you don't have God, a firm foundation in a God, then the logical and consistent conclusion is always nihilism and determinism. Always. A lot of atheists will not like that I just said that. Right? And there's been times, like many times, that I've talked to people and I'll bring that up and they'll say absolutely not. And then you can talk about that. But I am fully convinced that without God, if you follow the logic of what your worldview needs, it always ends in nihilism. And if you don't know what nihilism is, it's basically the refusal of any morality and purpose, right? Meaning things like that. There's no immaterial, there's just, right, the material. Therefore, you can't have true purpose, good and evil, right? There's no essence to anything, no identity in anything. And so it's just this, right, sad thing. And I met someone who claimed to be an optimistic nihilist on campus, and like he was very firm that it was like optimistic nihilism, and I was like, those don't fit together, right? But then I'd also say the second part is determinism, right? Without some immaterial part to people, it's just a cascading cause and effect, right? Input, output for all of history. All there is matter, all there is systems, and it's just been happening. There's more there, but I think that really is the key, is without God, you always come to these conclusions, if you're consistent. The key is most people aren't consistent. The vast majority, there's very few people who are willing to accept both of those. Some of the top atheistic minds in the world right now, people like Sam Harris, will not accept those. He's brilliant. But he finds ways to try and kind of do wordplay, if I'm being honest, redefine evil, good, purpose. He gives them new definitions so that you can say they exist. But he's changing the game. If you look at them for how they are, you must end at these two. And the key phrase is might makes right. Without God, you always end up in might makes right. How do you resolve conflicts between societies? Whoever's stronger, they'll be remembered as right until they're not, right? Until another society comes along eventually in the future. How do you figure out majority? Again, might makes right. Whatever takes up the majority, whoever conquers the majority, right? Human flourishing, whoever's the strongest gets to decide what flourishing means. And so we end up with might makes right or God. And I think that's a good phrase to remember. You do want to press people on that. Because nihilism, determinism, they're incompatible with what we think of morality as being. What most people generally know morality is. Something you'll also hear quite often is that morals are always changing, clearly. This is Richard Dawkins. You've probably heard the name, now you know the face to match it with, except most of his things he looks a lot younger. This is very recent. But that's him, and he makes a case, and I've heard it many times now watching his stuff, where people ask him, where do we get morality? And he always says the same thing of, he has a British accent, I'm not going to try it, but it would make me sound smarter. But he says that's a, intensely or profoundly difficult question. And I'm not sure, we get it from somewhere, and he has more to say on it, right? He has a worldview, but he kind of dances around it. But what he does say is but we obviously don't get it from religion, because it's always changing. The morals of the people who created the religions are vastly different than our 21st century morals. Just look back each century, they're always changing, and you're going to hear that a lot. What do we say? Is that true?
No.
Is that not true? Why not?
You just got to go back to what you said earlier about love, humility, honor, patience, sacrifice.
Anytime a non-believer or someone like Dawkins comments on religion, you want to kind of put a question mark out there. It's like, okay, are you really looking into that and understanding it deeply, or just throwing stones?
And we certainly have to think critically about it, right? Because always there will be things that are intellectually challenging. And this is just good advice for apologetics in general, is you do not need to know all the answers. You never will. So if the minute someone says something that you're like, I don't know if there's an answer to that, or I don't have the answer to that. Like, if you think because you don't have it, you're failed, and you're gonna crumble. It's gonna be horrible, right? You're just gonna be deflated. That's not how it works. There's brilliant people out there who I believe are under a delusion. Richard Dawkins' book is called The God Delusion, right? But believe they're under lies from Satan. So it can't be true, right? They can't go together. And so you have to say, I believe there are answers out there. And if you are encountered with something that you don't know the answer to, don't panic, right? If you have like a doubt of, well, what's the answer to this? Like, it's not over. Seek out the answer, right? Like, ask people, do the research, think about it. People have been thinking about these things for decades. So when you hear someone like Richard Dawkins make he's very eloquent. And when he makes an eloquent case for why morality is changing, you just want to step back, take time to think about it, and I would answer it like this. We have to define what sociology versus morality is, and people very often make this different. Very often get this wrong. Sociology is how cultures act based on what they interpret right and wrong to be. Sociology is, in essence, the study of societies throughout history, and what they think is right and what they think is wrong, right, and what they do based on that. Morality is what actually is right or wrong. Okay, so here's like an example that I've heard, is all throughout history, people have different burial rituals, what to do with their dead. So I heard an example, I can't remember the exact peoples now, admittedly. You might have heard this before, if you do, let me know. But it might have been the Greeks, I think, or something like that. But there was some people group who would burn their dead, right? Make like a funeral pyre, right? And just, had it burn away in honor and all this stuff. And it was very kind of stoic, right? And then there was another people group, and I believe it was like the barbarians, right, from the north, or like near Germany, but I'm not 100% sure. And they would let their dead, they'd put them out and let like the birds come and eat them, and nature take them, right? And so the people who let nature take them said we're giving them back to nature, right? Like in honor, letting them go back and help the environment like one last time. The people who burned them, right? It was this ritual of honor, and to send them up in one final blaze, glory and all this stuff. And when they encountered each other, they were like disgusted, right? Like, you burn your dead like trash, right? Because people used to burn trash. It's like, that's horrible. How like evil of you. That's so disrespectful. And the other people were like, you let grandma, do you just put her on the road for the crows to take her? What? What's wrong with you? Right? But here's the key. They disagreed on which one was the right or wrong to do, but what's the connecting thread? Exactly. Honoring the dead. Right? They both agreed it's right to honor your dead. So the sociology of how they enact that was different, but the core moral of respecting the dead was there, and it always has been. Right? And there are core morals throughout history, and that's C.S. Lewis's whole argument, if you've read Abolition of Man, he makes a case that throughout time and cultures, there are core fundamental morals that stay the same, right? No culture has ever said it's good to turn your back on your allies in war. No culture has ever said it's good to double cross your loved ones, right? Things like this. There are core morals, and yes, the sociology changes, but do those core morals really change throughout time? Now, I want to be cautious. There's not a perfect one-to-one connection, okay? So as Christians, we believe that your moral conscience, right? You're made in the image of God. You have the law in your heart, but it can be seared, right? It can be corrupted. So we can't, at least I don't think we can, pick out these like 5 set things that everyone has always said, this is right, it's not changing no matter what, right? You can't go against it. I don't think that's how it works. But we do see a very strong trend throughout history of these core morals sticking together. And I would add this. I think this is important. We see a trend of Satan has to bypass God's moral law, right? The law on our conscience to, commit, inspire or use people to commit atrocities and things like that, right? The enemy, just evil, has to bypass God's moral law. And so what's the most common version we've seen of that? It's you have to, if you're going to murder, everyone knows murder's wrong. So how do you make it right? You have to dehumanize someone, right? Some group, something to make it okay, right? So the first one that I'm sure comes to your mind is Hitler. How do you get an entire country to go for the eradication of a people group with decently clear consciences for most of them, or at least a lot of them? How do you do it with a clear conscience? And like, yes, we should do this. You have to dehumanize them. We're not killing people. It's wrong to murder my neighbor, but these are Jews. Right? Dehumanize. Okay? Same thing with slavery. How do you treat someone in that way? You have to dehumanize them. Right? It's wrong to treat my cousin like this, but this is an African. Right? Dehumanize. I would propose this. What is the number one place today that we see people fighting over and dehumanizing someone? We're fighting over, to use a political term, personhood. Exactly. Right? The unborn. And so I think it's just a reminder to us as Christians, how do you bypass morality? We can look at the trends throughout history. And I think the number one place we see that today is with the unborn. Right? You always have to dehumanize. And so today, there's arguments over, is this a human? And using terms like, do we apply personhood to this? We've heard that before many times. And it's always, right, in the wake of these atrocities that have happened. I just think that's important. But going back, I suppose, to the topic is just, how have moralities really changed? Have the fundamental morals throughout culture and time really changed? I would argue no. I think we can show that to people. Again, it's not a perfect one-to-one, but the general trend, absolutely. Okay, last 2 points, and then we'll wrap it up, is just a reminder, I like to view it in this way. There's only 2 consistent options. So when you talk to people about this, when you ask questions to them, as we've been showing a bunch of questions, right, that you can ask, all the answers to these have been questions. The 2 consistent options are there's no God and no good and evil, or there is God and there is good and evil. That's it. And so when we talk to people, we want to ask questions to guide them down one of these paths. And don't think that getting someone to this answer is a loss. I used to. I'd ask questions and get someone to be consistent, and they'd end by saying, I guess, no. You might be shocked. There have been many instances at campus, at School of Mines, where a conversation ends with me saying, or someone else saying, so judging based on your worldview, you cannot truly condemn Hitler for being evil. It's your opinion. And someone saying, I don't like how you worded that, but yes. It's like, I've been recording this whole conversation. I'm now going to send it to the FBI. Thanks so much. Right? But I used to think, well, where do I go from here? We're stuck. But that's not a loss, because again, putting the pebbles in people's shoes, everyone has the law written on their hearts. They know. Okay? So you want someone to realize, this is what I believe. And they have to live with that. Can you live with that? No one can. So either they can just suppress it again, or they have to face the facts of, well, is there something out there then? Right? So that's our goal in this. And like we said, to provide a better option. Another tip is just, we've been doing it all evening, use extreme examples. It really is handy. And don't always, I used Hitler a lot tonight, but Hitler's too easy in a sense. A lot of people have this notion of it's kind of a one-off thing. Right? Well, that was the Nazis. right? We have no shortage of human atrocities throughout history. You can pull from them. Be specific, right? Really press someone on how they can condemn infamous people, right? Stalin, Pol Pot, right? How can they truly condemn these people in their worldview? What truly makes them wrong? You do want to press people on this, but again, do it lovingly, do it wise. Don't be out in the plaza yelling at someone like, you love the Nazis, right? Like, you're a neo-Nazi. Right, like, you want to be wise with it. But I think there is a way to direct this in love and to show, I have a reason. We both agree these men are horrible. I know why I can say that, right? I have a reason to account for that. You don't, right? And to lure them in with that. Okay, Hitchin Challenge. I love this. It's very fun. We can maybe do it after if people want it, but we don't have to. In review. Not only, so if God does not exist, objective moral duties and values do not exist. Objective moral duties and values do exist, therefore God exists. That is the moral argument. I think we've talked through it tonight. We've gotten some of the objections. But here's the last part is, not only does God exist, but we as Christians know we get to live righteously. We get to act morally now because we've been redeemed. We've been united with him through his Son and by his Spirit. And what a joy. Not only do we just say there's morality out there, but we get to, again, have the ultimate standard and live righteously. We have the capabilities for it now. And so it's important, share that hope, right? We give the defense for the hope within us. So when you talk to people about this, let them know of that hope. You're right, there is good and evil. And I know why, and I know how we can live good. The ultimate good, and it came to us. Okay. We're done. As Sam the MG put it, Sam Wise, the man, there is in fact good in this world. And it is very much worth fighting for. I'm going to pray us out. I ended 1 minute later than last time, so I'm a failure. I'm sorry. If you have questions, please come up and ask. If some of you want to hear the Hitchens challenge, it's very interesting. It's something he tried to stump Christians with. I think there's a great answer. It's good, but we can talk about that after. But you're free to go and pray us out. All right, dear Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for each person here. Thank you for the opportunity to do this. As always, Lord, we just pray that it's helpful, that it is beneficial. That these aren't just words going into our brain and exiting tomorrow in a week, but that you would help us to retain what we need to know to impact those around us. Give us wisdom on what questions to ask those around us. Give us boldness to talk to the family members, to the friends, to the people who we don't know yet. Perhaps if we just go out, Lord, but let us share the good news and why we believe in it, and why not only is it just wonderful, but how everything points to it, making it all the more wonderful, Lord. So thank you that we have the truth, that it doesn't need to be propped up, that you have given ample evidence for it in your world, and through just logic in our minds. Yeah, and give us confidence as we go from here. Thank you for each person here, and them taking the time to do this. We pray in your name, amen. Amen. Okay, thank you. Sorry we moved really fast. I saw a couple small hands, so if you want to ask those questions. Yes.
What is the link you were going to provide, the link to the last?
Yeah, so if you'd like to, I'm realizing I probably can't send it to you all. If you want to watch the resurrection talk from 2 weeks ago, go to YouTube and look up Ratio Christi, RATIOCHRISTI. Oh, would you believe that? Take a picture of it. Yeah. So look up Ratio Christi Southwest Community Church, and there should be one with 5 views, and it'll be it'll say reliability of the resurrection. Southwest Community Church. But I think if you look up Ratio Christi Southwest,
And this, are you going to do the same thing?
yes, this one will be posted probably in a couple days. And so, same thing, if you'd like to look it up. If you want the outlines for something, I know someone wanted them last time to take pictures, please do. Take the outlines, they're yours. If you want to send them somewhere else, I'd be honored. That means they're not horrible. And just as a side note, the outlines, I do them in a way that I imagine is helpful, right? Because there's no way you'll remember all the information from these talks. There's no way. Right? And so the goal is that the outlines are actually a resource. You can look back and say, oh yeah, right, here's the points, here's how it was formatted. But if it's too much, and you'd rather just more space to take notes, or if you want more, although I doubt it, let me know. I'm happy, whatever's most helpful for you all, please let me know, and I'm happy to change it. Yes.
What is the
Do you want me to cut this?
Oh, I forgot about the cannibalism example. No! So, throughout history, oh yes, please cut that. There's cannibalistic tribes.